Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Happy to have you here today so that we can discuss another case. We are currently in our Unsolved series, so as you can tell, this case is going to be an unsolved case, obviously. And this one I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer of, because this does have to do with the death of a child, and it does have to do with the murder of a child. And I know that a lot of people don't like hearing about that stuff or learning about that stuff or consuming true crime content that has to do with children. So if that is you, I have plenty of other videos that do not include any children, and you are more than welcome to go watch those. But this video might not be for you if you do not like hearing about things happening to kids. So with all that being said, let's just jump into this case. So this case is about Stephanie Crowe. This is the murder of Stephanie Crowe, and this happened in the 1990s. So it's a little bit older, but not still recent enough to be relevant. So Stephanie Ann Crowe was born on April 12th, 1985 to her parents Stephen and Cheryl Crowe in San Diego, California. And she also had an older brother named Michael Crowe, who was 2 years older than her, and she ended up getting a younger sister named Shannon Crowe. So her and her whole family lived in a suburban town called Escondido, California, which is part of San Diego County. It's about 20 miles north of the city of San Diego, but it is still part of San Diego County. It's a little bit smaller than San Diego, but there's still a lot of people going in and out, basically. And Stephanie was described by her friends and family as a very social girl, very extroverted, very energetic, very happy. And she was also just a social butterfly. She was involved with her church choir, and she even took her own time to volunteer at the Escondido Library's youth program. And her parents said that even though Stephanie was only 12, that she was already always putting others before herself, and that she was just a super selfless person and always wanted to make others smile.
Stephanie was full of life. From the moment she woke up till she went to sleep, she was busy doing things, and she always gave 100%.
And just a couple of things about her: she loved the Spice Girls, and her favorite movie was Titanic. Now, the night of January 20th, 1998, Stephanie was 12, and Stephanie's parents claim that it was just like any other night. It was a completely normal night. And Cheryl was actually relaxing in her room when Stephanie knocked on her mom's door, and she told her mom that she was gonna go to bed. So they said, "Good night, I love you, see you tomorrow." And then Stephanie went to her room to go to sleep. However, we know that sometime after 9:30 p.m., Stephanie would be stabbed 8 times on her head and on her torso. And we know that while she was wounded and bleeding out, that she crawled to the doorway of her room in an attempt to get out and get help. However, she ended up collapsing in the doorway before she was able to receive any help. So the next morning, January 21st, 1998, Michael, her brother, Stephanie's brother, woke up at around 4:30 in the morning saying that he said he had a headache, a really bad headache, and he was sick with the flu at this time, so this is not crazy to think that he probably had some kind of sinus headache. And he turned on his TV in his room for some light and went to the kitchen to get some Tylenol for his headache. And he took the Tylenol with a glass of milk. And Michael said that in total, he was only in the kitchen for about 15 minutes before he was going to head back to his room and trying to get some more sleep. He said as he passed by everyone else's room that the doors were all closed, so it was just a normal, how it always is in that early in the morning. However, this is a little odd in hindsight, considering that Stephanie was gone by this point, and her body would have been in the doorway of her bedroom. It's just a little weird, but also not to mention that Stephanie's room was directly across from Michael's, so they had like this little, I'm sure a lot of you have seen it when you go upstairs and there's just almost like a hallway of rooms, and then on one end you maybe have like a little triangle, and or like a little square, and there's 2 rooms facing each other. That was Michael and Stephanie's rooms. So he would have basically made eye contact with her room when coming out of his room, and probably when going back to his room as well. Now, this could be written off at the fact that it was dark outside. I mean, it was 4:30 in the morning, the sun hadn't risen. He could have just been working off of instinct getting back to his room. We don't know that he had like a lot of light with him or anything like that. So it's not crazy to think that he didn't see it. It is just a little odd to point out that all of the bedroom doors were closed when they were obviously not. So he went back to his room, shut the door, and tried to go back to sleep. Now, at around 6:30 a.m., roughly 2 hours later, Judith Kennedy, who was Stephanie's grandmother, who I couldn't find if she was living with the family at the time, or if she just always lived there, if she was just visiting, but she had been there for a little bit. So Stephanie's grandmother, Judith, woke up to an alarm sound that was coming from Stephanie's room, and it wasn't turning off, and the grandma was like, oh, I'll just go see, maybe, Stephanie's just not awake yet, or she's not hearing this alarm going off. And in the doorway, when Judith went to Stephanie's room, Stephanie's body was found surrounded by a giant pool of blood. There was so much blood around this. And Judith screamed when she saw this, obviously, and this woke everybody else in the house up, and obviously coming over to see what she was screaming at. And Stephanie had multiple stab wounds that were visible on her body, and she was only found to have 1 defensive wound, and none of the other 5 people in the house at the time of her death were in any way alerted. They didn't hear screams, they didn't hear yelling, they didn't hear, like glass breaking from somebody breaking in. They said they heard nothing. However, due to this, it is believed that Stephanie woke up only for a brief second, and she was disoriented, and then she lost consciousness again, so there wasn't really any time for her to defend herself. And it's believed that a 5 or 6 inch blade was used. Something else that's a little eerie is that a mystery novel entitled The Twisted Window was underneath her right foot when they found her body. And upon seeing her body, her dad, Stephen, obviously immediately called 911, and I will play part of the 911 call for you right now.
My daughter! What's the problem? She laid on the floor, she stopped breathing. There's blood all over the place, please! Oh, we gotta help her! My daughter's dead!
So, after the police come and they're investigating the crime scene, they found that all of the windows and doors were reportedly locked the night before, besides the sliding glass door in the master bedroom where the parents were sleeping, and a window in Stephanie's room that was cracked just a little bit to allow a phone line through. And for Stephanie's window, they did obviously investigate this, but the screen was completely undisturbed. The screen was not torn, the screen was not taken out, the screen was not broken. It was completely undisturbed. After they look throughout this entire house, they find that there is absolutely no signs of forced entry, visible forced entry. No locks, no doors, no windows were broken at all. They also obviously searched for fingerprints and could not find any suspicious fingerprints in the house at all. The FBI, when looking into this crime, describes the crime as highly organized and targeted. I mean, nobody else was assaulted in any kind of way, nobody heard anything, and nobody else's even rooms were touched, much less the people were touched. And Stephanie was actually not sexually assaulted in any way, and the killer had managed to take the murder weapon and never leave any signs of forced entry. To this day, actually, the knife that was used has never been found. The murder weapon has never been found. And according to an FBI crime scene analyst who would speak later at Stephanie's trial, the killer or killers had comfort, knowledge, and familiarity with the Crowe home. So, because of this, the police immediately looked at Michael, which was Stephanie's brother, and they ended up looking at Michael's 2 friends. Not only because it appeared to be an inside job, but according to the investigators, Michael was acting very strange after they got to the scene, considering his sister had just been brutally murdered. He had just seen his sister's dead body. He allegedly was very distant, unattached, cold, and even at one point was holding a Game Boy and just playing on the Game Boy while they were trying to ask the parents questions about their murdered daughter. You can't make assumptions based off of this. Everybody acts different. He could have been in shock, he could have been in trauma. Everybody acts differently when given this sort of news, so it's not okay to go based off of that alone. However, since they assumed it was an inside job, the whole family was taken into custody for questioning right away. And initially, they were all put in the same room and questioned sort of as a family unit. And the investigators told them that, you're not under arrest and you're free to leave if you feel uncomfortable. We are only here to try to get answers about Stephanie. We're not here to accuse you of things. However, at one point, one of the officers tried to separate Shannon and Michael from Cheryl and Stephen. So they were trying to separate the minors, the kids, from their parents. And Stephen wanted to leave because he didn't feel comfortable with his children being questioned without either them in the room or an attorney or a lawyer present. This is all by Stephen's account. However, he said that when he went to the doors of the police station to leave, because he didn't like the implications that were being put on him or his son, that the doors were locked, and as he turned around, he saw several police officers were all standing there with their guns drawn and pointed at him. One officer pointed a gun and put it at his chest and said, "Get back upstairs." And he said at this point that they all felt helpless and that they had to comply and they had to answer all their questions. Now, like I said before though, the police department denies that any of this ever happened. However, Stephen says that it did. So it's up to you who you want to believe, I suppose. Now, let's get into a little bit about Michael. And remember, Michael is Stephanie's older brother. Michael was known as a very shy kid. So how Stephanie was more extroverted, he was definitely more introverted. He didn't really have a big circle of friends. He had a very tight-knit circle of friends, only a couple, and he wasn't a very social kid at school or anything like that. He liked to read, he likes to play video games, do kind of hobbies by himself. One of the most important rules for good investigating, I just have to mention, is that you let the evidence develop the theory. You don't let the theory develop the evidence, which basically means you can't go in thinking one thing and then ignore other things because you want everything to match what you already think. Instead, you need to come to a conclusion based off of all the facts given. This is something that the Escondido Police Department did not do when it came to Stephanie's case. They believed that since all of the young boys, being Michael and his two friends, enjoyed playing like fantasy and, sometimes violent video games, that they must have wanted those violent fantasies to come to life, basically. This was the Escondido Police Department's logic. So once they didn't see any sign of forced entry, they believed, it was an inside job. It must have been Michael and his two friends since they also enjoyed playing these violent video games. From there, they ended up finding a hair on Stephanie's body that was a perfect match to Michael's, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could be circumstantial considering they were brother and sister, they lived together, and their rooms were literally right across from each other. It's not crazy to think that one of his hairs could have just landed on her floor and it got on her. It's very likely that it was there before. However, the police took this as evidence against Michael. So they started interrogating him, and the interrogations started to get incredibly intense. The cops interrogating Michael used something called the Reed method, which is a method where basically they create an extremely high pressure environment and then they follow it with sympathy and kindness, but only if the accused starts divulging information or confessing to something, even if that thing is not true. This method in today's world has actually been linked to an extremely high number of false confessions because it's so high pressure and they're treated terribly until they give the police officers what they want, which half the time what the police officers want is a confession. Now, in addition to this, the boys, when being interrogated, were given nothing to eat and they couldn't even sleep for 27 hours of just being questioned about the same thing, even though they already answered all of their questions. Also, not only did they interrogate all of these boys without any parent present or lawyer present, even though they initially promised the parents at the beginning that one of the parents was allowed to be present with the children at all times, they also lied and said that they had found Stephanie's blood in Michael's room when this wasn't true at all, which actually is illegal. You cannot lie. You can't fabricate evidence to try to get somebody to confess. They also told Michael that someone in the house would have had to do it. So he basically said, it's either you or, your mom, your dad, Shannon, somebody did it in your house. So if it wasn't you, then tell us who it was. And Michael, of course, was put on the spot. So he was like, I'm not going to put any of my family members in that position because I know none of them did it, but he knew that he didn't do it either. So they definitely put him into kind of a sticky situation. And when Michael was asked to take a lie detector test, he responded with, I feel like I just spent all day away from my family. I couldn't see them. I feel like I'm being treated like I killed my sister and I didn't. It feels horrible, like I'm being blamed for it. Everything I own is gone. Everything I have is gone. Everything. You won't even let me see my parents. It's horrible. And that's just one of the sad quotes that was said during this time, because the boys were trying to get out of these interrogations, get back to their families, but the police literally would not let them. So throughout the intensive interrogations that took place, Michael, along with the other two friends that I mentioned, whose names were Aaron Hauser and Joshua Treadway, all made incriminating statements to the investigators, which implicated them in the murder. And this was due to the extreme pressures of the interrogations that took place. They claimed that they were not guilty, but they were telling the police officers what they wanted to hear. So all the boys' stories were that Michael and Aaron committed the crime while Josh had kept lookout. So they went further with these statements, and Josh claims that Michael snuck into the bedroom and silenced his sister so she couldn't scream, while Aaron was the one to actually commit the crime. And when asked the motive behind it, Michael said that he felt like everything Stephanie did was better than what he did, that she was always one-upping him in some way, that she was always the center of attention, and he never got to feel the praise that she got. Now, what's interesting is that Aaron Hauser actually never officially confessed. He never said, I did this crime. However, he did tell them a story of hypothetically how he would commit this crime if he had committed it. And he even went into extreme graphic details about how, Stephanie was a young girl and where exactly you would have to stab her in order to do the most damage, which was disturbing to police officers to hear. Something else that was a little weird that the investigators took note of was while they were interrogating Josh, he actually said that he was really afraid of Aaron and wouldn't really go into too many details, but just said that he would never want to be in a room alone with Aaron, which is interesting. And investigators thought this was just a weird thing to say about somebody who's supposed to be your friend. Why would you be friends with someone who you're scared of? And based on all of these statements given, in addition to the fact that they ended up finding a knife under Josh's bed at home, which he claims belongs to his older brother. However, his brother said, no, it's Josh's. And it turns out they were actually able to trace this knife back to Aaron. So police found this out after Aaron's mom called the police and reported that one of her son's knives from his knife collection that he had was missing. And Josh said that he had taken the knife from Aaron, but it was just under his bed since then. He had never used it for anything. And Josh explained taking it in the first place because apparently Aaron gave it to him and Aaron told him that he needed to get rid of it. So he just put it under his bed and didn't think about it. So Michael, Aaron, and Joshua all get charged with Stephanie's murder. And the police had Michael write an apology letter to Stephanie, and they were actually able to use this as a written confession, even though they told him exactly what to write. And as the investigation continued, they also found that Michael had actually recently written a fictional story for one of his classes in which the main character kills his sister. And they also found that on Stephanie's windowsill, the words "kill, kill" were written in pencil. However, there was no indication of who wrote them. Also, something that's kind of sad is due to the intense interrogations and all the questioning that the police were doing to Michael and his friends, Michael was actually unable to attend his sister's funeral, and this just put so much more grief on the family and onto Michael, and it just made the whole family even sadder about everything. Now, during the trial, the defense for the boys argued that the boys had been coerced into giving false confessions because of the psychological pressure as well as manipulative tactics used from the interrogators. Now, the defense also pointed out the inconsistencies throughout the boys' stories, as well as a severe lack of physical evidence. Further into the trial, DNA evidence showed that the DNA found at the crime scene did not match any of the boys, but rather an unknown fourth person, just an unknown person. And in 1999, they actually ended up dropping the charges against the boys because they were going to start pursuing a new lead in order to find this mystery DNA sample. However, the charges were dropped with the exception that they could be tried again if more evidence came out against them. Now, the boys at this time had served 6 months in jail, and after the charges were dropped, there was a new suspect that had actually come up on the police's radar. And this was a 28-year-old homeless man who was known to hang around Escondido from time to time, and his name was Richard Raymond Tuitt. Now, Richard was a diagnosed schizophrenic and did have a history of erratic behavior. And the night of Stephanie's murder, actually, neighbors said that he was knocking on people's doors, saying disturbing things while attempting to look for an old girlfriend, somebody named Tracy Nelson. In interviews with Tracy, she said that they used to party together when she was really young, and they would often get high together. They were really into the party and drug scene. And she also said that Richard would often talk himself into a state of paranoia, and he would convince himself that people were watching him, or he would think things were there when they were really not. And I also do think it's important to mention, just a little side note, that Stephanie and Tracy actually did kind of look alike. So it's possible that he was looking for Tracy and thought he found her, but instead found Stephanie. Now, there were multiple phone calls to the police that night that reported what Richard was doing in this neighborhood, and he was described by people calling at the time as wearing a red sweatshirt with a white t-shirt underneath, and that he was acting very disoriented. And Richard did also have a violent past. In 1993, he was arrested for attacking a man with a knife. And Richard was taken into custody by the police the day after Stephanie's murder, and all his clothes were confiscated. However, they had let him go in order to pursue the lead that they had with Michael and his friends, and they claimed that they didn't have any incriminating evidence against Richard, which they didn't really have any incriminating evidence against the boys either. Originally, the police only had tested the white t-shirt for evidence rather than all the clothes he was wearing that day. So they collected all the clothes off of him, but only tested the white t-shirt for some reason. However, during the boys' trial, the public defender for Josh actually noted that there was a weird mark on Richard's sweatshirt when they were going through the evidence. And when she looked at it further, she demanded that the investigators test it for evidence as well once she learned that they hadn't already done that. And when the DNA lab came back with the results from the red sweatshirt, it was actually revealed that there were 3 spots on the sweatshirt, and all of them were of Stephanie Crowe's blood. And when everyone came down hard on the prosecution and the investigators for not examining the sweatshirt sooner, exploring every possibility, just going straight for the boys, they said that there were stains everywhere on the sweatshirt, and they just didn't think it was that important. You are solving a murder trial and you didn't think it was important to test stains on a sweatshirt? Investigating 101 in my opinion, but Richard claims that he had found this sweatshirt while dumpster diving that night. And when being brought in for questioning, he actually was already in prison at the time for a burglary charge. And Richard did state while being interrogated that he was inside of the Crowe household that night, but he didn't kill Stephanie. He had nothing to do with Stephanie's murder. And he didn't end up going to trial until 4 years after he was initially questioned. And something crazy that happened was during the lunch hour of Richard's jury selection for his trial, he escaped from custody And police had to run around and try to find him after not paying attention to where he ran off to. Luckily, they finally got him back to go to the trial, and they ended up finding him after about 3 hours of him just being on the run. And something that's also interesting is that when he appeared at trial, his defense had completely changed his appearance to make him look really clean cut, just like any other guy. I'll put a side-by-side of his mugshot from the night that he was in the Crowe household and how he ended up looking in court, and it is very different. And Richard's mother and sister were actually there for the whole trial to support Richard, and in interviews they stated that Richard was just not capable of something like this, that he was a young man who had a promising future, but that he had been led down the wrong path, and that he was just not capable of murder. Some other damning evidence that ended up coming out during the trial was that there was Stephanie's blood on his white t-shirt as well, which I don't know why that wasn't discovered sooner when the police said that they had tested the white t-shirt for DNA and didn't find anything. It's also interesting because he claims to have found the red sweatshirt dumpster diving, but if he was already wearing the white t-shirt and the white t-shirt also had blood on it, the blood would have already been there, so I don't know. It's weird. The defense argued that the police must have put Stephanie's blood on his clothing, and they said that when the investigators were taking Richard's clothes to be examined, that they must have put it in with other evidence and that it got mixed, and that's how Stephanie's blood must have gotten there. And the 3 boys that were initially accused, so her brother Michael and his friends Aaron and Josh, actually ended up testifying at the Richard Tuitt trial. And they had just claimed that they had no involvement and that they were very young and coerced into making false statements because they were so nervous. And this kind of gave the prosecution an opportunity to be like, well, if the boys didn't do it, then there's this guy who has evidence against him. He must have been the one to do it. So the jury ended up deliberating for 8 days, and Richard did receive a verdict of voluntary manslaughter on May 26, 2004. And he was given a 13-year sentence originally, which that seems incredibly low. But then he actually had 4 years added on because of his attempted escape that he had done during jury selection, which brought him to a total of 17 years. So voluntary manslaughter basically means that he did kill Stephanie and that he's admitting to killing, well, not admitting, but that he did kill Stephanie, but without malice and without premeditation, that it was just a spur of the moment thing. However, he actually ended up appealing his conviction, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ended up overturning the decision, and he ended up being retried in October of 2013. And on December 6, 2013, Richard was actually acquitted of voluntary manslaughter. And he had served 8 years of his sentence at this point, and the jury had just said that there was not sufficient evidence linking Richard to the crime, given that there was no signs of forced entry and there were no fingerprints left at the scene. And they thought if he was so, disoriented, and if this really was just a spur of the moment killing, he wouldn't have not left any evidence, even accidentally. And this actually brings us to where we are now. That's the most recent kind of update with the case. And the case is still unsolved. And some good to come from this tragedy, however, was that more attention was brought to false confessions and how investigators interrogate people and how, evidence is analyzed. And all of the boys' families actually ended up being able to win a lawsuit against the Escondido Police Department. And as for Richard, he recently in April of 2021 pled guilty to a meth possession charge, so he's in jail right now. And Stephanie's memory still lives on in a memorial grove called Oak Hill Memorial Park, and it's in Dixon Lake, California, where they planted 12 trees, and it was one for each year of her life. Michael currently lives in Oregon with his family, and him, as well as Aaron and Josh, have all been found factually innocent, and all their records have been formally cleared of anything having to do with Stephanie's murder. So Stephanie's family and law enforcement are still to this day looking for who's responsible or looking for further evidence. So if you have any information about this or know anything at all about that night in Escondido, please call 760-839-4722. And that's the end of the Stephanie Crowe case. That's all we know, and probably will continue to know, which is kind of sad, but I really want to know your guys' opinions about this. Do you think that they were right initially with Michael? I mean, it is a little weird that he didn't see Stephanie's body, but it was dark. Or do you think it's possible it could have been Richard and that they just didn't have enough evidence, but that he just happened to get really lucky and didn't leave enough evidence at the scene for them to process? I just really want to know what you guys think about this case, and if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel because it really helps me out a lot. And I will see you in the next case that I do. We still have a couple more of the unsolved cases, so hope you guys are looking forward to that because I know I am. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.